Welcome to the channel. Today's story is full of surprises and real drama. Subscribe and like to stay updated. Let's dive in. Since I was a kid, I always wanted to be a firefighter. It all began when I saw this old photo of my dad and grandpa together, taken when Dad first joined the fire department. My name is Jake Turner, but everyone just calls me Jake. When I was born, my sister Nina was 3 and had trouble pronouncing my full name, so she called me Jake, and the name stuck. In the 4th grade, we had an assignment to write about what we wanted to be when we grew up and then had to read it to the rest of the class. A lot of the guys wrote that they wanted to be athletes or pilots, but I said I wanted to be a fireman. On the playground at recess that day, Rob Carter started teasing me about wanting to be a fireman. He called my dad a hose monkey and said I was a little hose monkey. Oink oink, here piggy piggy, he kept yelling. I told him to stop, but he kept it up, yelling louder and louder. When he shoved me down, I got up and punched him in the face. He grabbed his bleeding nose and ran to the teachers, crying. I got to sit in the principal's office until Mother came to school and picked me up. Once we were in the car, I told her what had happened, and all she said was that Father would talk to me. The next morning, Father, who was working the evening shift, had left before we got home. I didn't sleep well that night. The next morning, after breakfast, Father asked me what had happened at school, and I told him everything. Jake, I appreciate you sticking up for me, but I've been called a lot worse. I'm a big boy, and I can take care of myself. You shouldn't have hit Timmy for calling me names, but sometimes you have to defend yourself against bullies who hit you first. I'm going to take you to school this morning, so get ready to go. Just before I walked into my classroom, Timmy came up to me and said he was sorry for calling me names and shoving me. My sister saw everything that happened and told my mom and dad. They were not too happy with me, he said. My dad told me I had to come to school today and apologize to you. Extending his hand, he asked, "Can we be friends?" Yes, I replied. We have been best friends ever since that day. Now fast forward 10 years to a couple of days after graduation from high school. Luke was over at my house, and we were trying to figure out what we would do for the rest of the summer. Father came home from work and had something for me. Jake, he said, the city is starting a fire cadet program. I have an application in my briefcase if you're interested. You'll get paid and be given cadet uniforms if you are selected. If you do well when you are 20 years old, you can go to the fire academy, graduate from there, and you will be hired by the fire department. Boy, that sounds like a good deal, Father, I said. It sure does, echoed Luke. Yep, Luke had come around to my way of thinking about a future career. Can I get an application too? He asked my father. You sure can, Father replied, taking another application from his briefcase. To make a long story short, we both filled out the application and gave them back to my dad. 2 weeks later, we found ourselves being tested both physically and psychologically and then had a final interview by some senior officers of the fire department. 3 days after all that happened, Father came home with good news for both of us. We had made the cut, and now we're officially Parkview Fire Department cadets. For the next few years, Luke and I learned a lot working as fire cadets. When Luke and I reached our 20th birthdays, we were enrolled in the fire academy. The training was intensive. In addition to the classroom, we received physical and more psychological training. We spent a lot of time on the training grounds, becoming more than just proficient with our equipment. Finally, after 16 weeks in the academy, graduation day came. I now have a photo of my dad pinning my badge on me, just like Grandpa did with him so many years ago. 6 months after that photo was taken, Father retired from the force. He and Mother moved to Augusta, Georgia, to be closer to my sister and her 2 little girls. Emila's husband, Ryan, had been a pilot in the Air Force and now was a civilian contractor working at the Air Force Base in Augusta. My probationary period was for 6 months. I was paired up with an experienced officer to reinforce what I had been taught at the academy. Luke received the same treatment. 10 weeks before my 21st birthday, I was on my own with my own call sign, Engine 6, and assigned to patrol the north end of the city. The North Zone stretched from Oak Ridge Street on the south to the city limits of Parkview on the north, and from the river on the east to Route 66 on the west. It was a mix of residential neighborhoods, motels, hotels, and businesses. 6 months later, Engine 6, respond to a domestic disturbance, 7892 Oak Ridge Street. Dispatch radioed me. 104 dispatch. Engine 6 en route, ETA 90 seconds, I answered. Domestic disturbances are tricky. You never know what you are going to walk into, so it's just good practice to call for backup before confronting the situation. Dispatch, Engine 6 on scene, I radioed as I pulled up behind Engine 8's truck. What do you have? I asked Luke Johnson, my longtime friend, whose call sign was Engine 8. This is Sarah Johnson, Luke answered, nodding toward an obviously distressed woman standing beside him. She told me that a former acquaintance of hers showed up about 20 minutes ago. He was drunk or strung out on drugs, so she didn't want to let him in the house. He pushed past her and produced a gun. When her daughter came into the room, he grabbed her and threw Ms. Johnson out. She ran to her neighbor and called us. That's all I know right now, he finished. Before he pushed me out, he said he was going to make my daughter a woman. You've got to stop him, she's only 14 years old, Ms. Johnson cried to us. Okay, calm down and wait here, I told her just as we heard a young girl screaming from inside the house. There's no time to get a hostage negotiator here. Luke, you take the front, and he'll go around back. Give me a minute before you go inside. Try and use that silver tongue of yours and see if you can defuse this, I told him. Going to the rear of the house, I found the screen door to the pool area unlocked and a sliding glass door to the kitchen open. Withdrawing my weapon and holding it down by the side of my leg, I entered the home. Moving toward the sound of voices, I slowly made my way to the front of the house. As I heard Luke starting to talk to the suspect, I entered the living room behind the suspect. I'm no expert, but this guy was strung out big time. I didn't believe any amount of smooth talking by Luke was going to end this situation peacefully. The guy had torn the young girl's t-shirt and had her jeans halfway down when Luke started telling him to back off and put his gun down. All he did was grab the girl tighter in front of him and point his gun at Luke. He yelled for Luke to get the hell out, and there was nothing Luke could do to stop him. Once more, Luke told him to put the gun down. He fired and hit Luke in his upper right leg. I yelled at him, and as he turned to face me, the girl managed to break away. He fired and hit me. The Kevlar vest did its job. I fired twice, hitting him in his chest just left of dead center. He fell, and I stepped over to him and kicked his gun away. Keying my radio, I yelled, "Dispatch, Engine 6, shots fired, officer down, emergency medical required immediately at this location." 104, Engine 6, EMTs on the way, dispatch replied. I dropped to my knees alongside Luke and looked for something to use as a compress to stop the bleeding from his leg. The young girl came over to me and handed me her torn t-shirt, saying, "Use this." Then she left the room. In what seemed like hours but was only a matter of minutes, the EMTs arrived and took over from me. I slumped back against the wall and watched as they administered to Luke. After stabilizing him, they placed him on a gurney and transported him to the hospital emergency room. Another EMT unit arrived, and one of them went over to the guy I shot. He felt for a pulse, and then just looked up at me and shook his head. By now, the whole place was flooded with firefighters, including Captain Lewis, my supervising officer. Before she could ask me anything, the girl reappeared with a new t-shirt on and dropped to sit beside me. I put my arm around her and said, "You'll be okay. It's over now. He can't hurt you anymore." She looked up and said to my captain, "He saved me. After that guy shot the other fireman, this officer shot him. If he hadn't done so, I truly believe that scum sucker would have assaulted and then killed me." Putting both of her arms around my neck, she pulled me close and kissing me on my cheek, she whispered in my ear, "I'll never forget what you did for me. Never, I promise I'll never forget you." Then she got up and left to go outside to her mother. "All right, Jake, what happened?" Captain Lewis asked me. I filled him in on everything from the time I got on the scene to when he arrived. "How about you? Are you hurt?" he asked me. "Yeah, my chest hurts like hell," I replied. Calling for one of the EMTs still in the room, he told them to get me over to the emergency room. In the emergency room, the doctor removed my Kevlar vest and uniform shirt to examine my chest. The Aholi was using hollow points. The bullet mushroomed when it struck you. Thank God you were wearing your vest. You're going to have one hell of a bruise. We're going to x-ray your chest just to be sure you don't have any broken ribs. Other than that, I said, I'll give you something for the pain before you leave. You should be fine in a few days, he said, patting me on the back as he left the examination room. As I was putting my shirt back on, Captain Moore, the shift supervisor, entered the room. How are you? The captain asked me. I'm okay, I guess. What about Luke, Officer Johnson? I asked him. He's still in surgery, but I've been told he'll be all right. Tell me what went down. After filling him in on what transpired, he told me I would be placed on paid administrative leave while Internal Affairs investigated the incident. It's policy, there's no getting around it. Then he told me that I had to see the department psychologist to be sure I had no lingering effects from having killed a man. You have nothing to worry about as far as IA is concerned. Everything points to a justifiable shooting. That's one nasty bruise you've got there. Use the 10 days leave to rest up. You did real good, son, real good. After checking with the doctor once more, I left the emergency room and went to the floor where Tim's surgery was being conducted. I saw his wife, Hannah. Luke got married just after finishing at the academy in the waiting room, surrounded by her family and numerous other firefighters. When she saw me, she got up and rushed over. Oh, Jake, she said, they told me that if you hadn't slowed the bleeding before the EMTs got there, he wouldn't have made it. Thank you, thank you. Are you hurt badly? No, it's just a bad bruise. I'm fine, I responded. Any more news about Luke? One of the nurses came out and told me that the doctors were just finishing up with him and would be out to speak with me in a few more minutes, she replied. Just as she finished telling me that, a surgeon came over to her with a big smile on his face. He's going to be fine, Mrs. Johnson. We're moving him to a recovery room, and you'll be able to see him shortly. With that good news, one of my fellow officers, Roy Daniels, came over and asked if I needed a ride home. I told him I would be ready to go in a few minutes. I wanted to say goodbye to Tim's wife before leaving. After Charlie dropped me at my apartment, I decided to call my father and tell him what happened. The phone rang, and Father picked up. Hi, Pop, it's me, Jake. I have to tell you what happened today. I killed a man this afternoon. The next morning, there was no point in staying in bed any longer. Sleep just wouldn't happen. After talking to Father for the better part of 2 hours last night, I just laid in bed, reliving every moment of what had happened the previous afternoon. Did I make the right decision? Was there any other way I could have handled the situation? Did he have to die by my hand? Anybody who tells you they wouldn't have lost a minute's sleep over what I had done is either a liar or a psychopath. After taking a shower and shaving, I dressed and walked to the corner store for a cup of coffee and a newspaper. The Parkview Times had an in-depth article about yesterday's events. The story had the facts pretty much correct. It did question whether the shooting was justifiable, however. That was answered after the reporter interviewed the mother and the daughter about what had happened. The remainder of the article focused on Tim's injury. When I returned home, there was a message on my home phone to call Captain Moore at headquarters right away. Picking up my cell phone from the counter where I had left it the night before, I read an identical text message from the captain. Returning the call, he directed me to come and see him immediately. When I arrived at headquarters on Eastwood Boulevard, I was met by a few of my fellow firefighters as I walked down the hallway to Captain Wilson's office. Many of them simply shook my hand and patted me on my shoulder. They didn't say anything to me, but their gestures spoke volumes of support. Arriving at the captain's office, I saw him look up from his desk and wave for me to come into the room. There was another man sitting with him in his office. Officer Smith, let me introduce you to Dr. Edward Michaels. He is the psychologist the department uses in these situations. He wants to talk with you for a while today. So, for the better part of the morning, the doctor and I sat and talked. Rather, I talked and he listened. When I had finished speaking, he looked up at me and said, Officer Smith, I heard nothing this morning that would indicate anything other than the normal, mentally healthy response to what occurred. I am clearing you to return to duty as soon as the internal affairs investigation is concluded. After shaking hands with Dr. Michaels, I left and drove to the hospital to see how Luke was doing. Walking into his room, I found Anna sitting beside his bed, talking with him. He was doing so well that he expected to be released from the hospital the next day. We visited for about an hour before I left. 10 days later, the internal affairs investigation was finished, and as Captain Moore had predicted, the shooting was ruled justifiable. I was cleared to return to work. 6 months later, I had just transitioned from midnights to the day shift, and my body was still adjusting to the new hours. My shift today was quiet, too quiet, one traffic stop and a backup to another unit on a DUI arrest. I was looking forward to some downtime at my apartment as I drove home. As I got out of my car in the parking lot, I heard screaming coming from the pool deck. Racing around to the pool area, I saw a woman holding a small puppy and frantically waving her free arm, pointing to the bottom of the pool. "She can't swim! She can't swim!" she screamed at me. I unfastened my gun belt, dropping it on the deck, and I dove into the pool. I retrieved a little girl from the water and brought her up to the side of the pool. Checking for a pulse, I found one, but she wasn't breathing. Checking her airway to be sure she hadn't swallowed her tongue, I began resuscitation. Being careful not to overinflate her tiny lungs, after 3 or 4 breaths, a wonderful thing happened. She vomited into my mouth. I got the remains of her lunch along with a large amount of water from the pool that she had swallowed. Then she began breathing on her own, and as I was placing her in the recovery position, the EMTs arrived. Relinquishing my responsibility for her, I moved away to let them work. Placing her on a gurney with an oxygen mask over her mouth and nose, they left. The older woman thrust the puppy into my arms and left with them. Great. Here I am, soaking wet, holding a small beagle puppy with no idea as to the identity of the woman. When Sam, one of the other residents, handed me my gun belt, I asked him if he had any idea who the child and woman were. "I think the kid is Sarah Sullivan's daughter, and the woman is her grandmother. Sarah and the little girl live in apartment 212, he told me. When I entered my apartment, I looked at the little dog and said, 'Well, it looks like it's just you and me for a while, little fellow.' I was rewarded with a big lick on my face. The first order was to get out of my wet uniform and into dry clothes. As I dried the puppy and removed his leash, I noticed the tag on his collar that identified him as Max. "Okay, Max, let's round up some dinner for both of us." After throwing a potato into the microwave, I retrieved a strip steak from the fridge and put it onto a grill pan on the gas range. All the while I was preparing dinner, Max sat and looked at me with his tail wagging in anticipation. Taking 2 plastic cereal bowls from the cupboard, I filled one with water and placed it on the floor. Then, cutting up a raw carrot, I put it into the bowl along with some pieces of my steak. When I sat down to my meal, I put the bowl on the floor next to the water dish. Max was finished eating before I could manage to even start with mine. After eating, I cleaned up the kitchen and reattaching his leash, Max and I went for a walk. Half an hour later, after visiting every tree and signpost in the neighborhood, we returned. Sitting in my recliner in front of the TV, I began flipping through the cable channels to find something to watch. Funny even. With 200 or so channels, there was nothing that caught my interest. Then I remembered I had recorded Monday night's football game on my DVR. As I settled back to watch, Max jumped up into my lap and promptly fell asleep. Halfway through the second quarter, I dozed off. Then the doorbell to my apartment rang. Max raised his head, barked once, and settled back down, asleep. Getting up and carrying the sleeping puppy, I went to see who was there. Outside was an older man and the woman I recognized from this afternoon. After inviting them inside, he said to me, "Hello, my name is John Davis, and this is my wife, Judy. We owe you a very deep debt of gratitude and a great deal of thanks for saving our granddaughter, Emma, this afternoon." "How is she?" I responded. Mrs. Sullivan answered me. "She's fine. The doctor wants to keep her overnight though, for observation, just to be sure. Her mother, Sarah, is spending the night with her. We stopped by to thank you and to pick Max up for her," she continued. "He was the first thing Emma asked about when we got to the hospital." Mrs. Sullivan then told me the whole story as to what happened. They were walking with him when he broke away from Emma and ran to the pool. He fell in, and as Emma went to pull him out, she fell in after him. Max managed to scramble out just as I arrived on the scene, she said. She was frantic and didn't think about anything when she thrust Max into my arms as she left to accompany her granddaughter to the hospital. "I hope he wasn't any trouble for you," she said as she reached to take the puppy from my arms. Once they left, after thanking me profusely once more, I returned to the football game. As I sat watching, I thought to myself that I missed the little guy's company. The next day, my next shift was Bija car accident followed by a hit and run, both before 10 a.m. At 11 a.m., a found property report resulted in recovering a lost engagement ring found on the beach. Some young lady will be very happy if she filed a lost property report and can identify the ring. Engine 6, respond to a call at 456 Elm Street, dispatch radioed. 104 dispatch. Engine 6 en route, I replied. I knew this address well. Mrs. Margaret Jones lived there. She was a nice old widow in her 70s. Her husband had retired from the New York City Fire Department more than 20 years ago and had recently passed away. Sometimes she got lonely and just wanted someone to talk to for a while. There was no way I was going to charge her with making nuisance calls to the fire department. I've tried to get her to stop calling the fire department, but so far, with not much luck. Pulling up in front of her house, I sensed something was not quite right. Instead of her waiting for me on the front steps, she was inside, peeking out from behind the curtains in the foyer. She opened the door and practically dragged me inside. There's something wrong across the street, she told me. Bill and Susan Thompson are at work, but I saw 2 young men go into their house. They don't belong in this neighborhood. That's their car over there, she said, pointing to an old beat-up Ford. Engine 6 requesting backup for 56 Elm Street, burglary in progress, I radioed dispatch. 104, Engine 6, dispatch answered. I instructed Mrs. Jones to wait inside while I went over to investigate. The suspected burglar's car had the keys still in the ignition, so I removed them. Just then, Alex Palmer, Engine 12, arrived, and he went around to the back of the house. I was just walking up to the front steps when the door opened and 2 teenagers walked out, carrying pillowcases stuffed with stolen property. Okay, guys, put the stuff down and put your hands on top of your head, I instructed them. Hey, Charlie! I yelled. I've got 2 out front. Cuffing both of them, we searched them for anything they shouldn't have in their pockets. They both had driver's licenses identifying them as juveniles, and I suspected they were skipping school. In case you didn't know, most residential burglaries take place between the hours of 9 a.m. and 4 p.m. when people are at work. Dispatch, 1015, prisoner in custody, Engine 12 transporting 2 to juvenile detention. Also, 1070, send tow truck to this location, white 85 Ford, plate XYZ123, tow to impound lot, I radioed. 104, dispatch responded. As I walked back across the street, Mrs. Jones emerged from her house and exclaimed, Wow, that was exciting. Praising her, I said, You did good, Mrs. Jones, real good. You did exactly what you should have done when observing something suspicious. She beamed with pride, and I knew she would now have something to talk about with her friends for weeks. Hopefully, she wouldn't be calling the fire department for a while. Then I thought to myself, it would be a good idea to come by and check on her a couple of times a week, just to talk. I went back to the squad car and began entering my report on my computer while waiting for the tow truck to arrive. All in all, it had been a productive day. That afternoon, I had just finished changing out of my uniform into a pair of shorts and a polo shirt when my doorbell rang. I answered it and discovered the little girl from yesterday standing there holding a plate of cookies covered with plastic wrap. Right behind her stood an attractive blonde young woman. As the little girl extended the plate of cookies, I knelt down in front of her, and she announced, My name is Emma, but you can call me Jess, like all my friends do. I'm 5 years old. These are for you. Mommy and I just finished making them. Mommy says I needed to come over and thank you for pulling me out of the pool. How did you know I can't swim? She said, all in one breath. Well, hello, Jess. My name is Jake. Thank you for the cookies. Boy, there seems to be a whole lot of them. I don't think I could possibly eat them all by myself. Would you and your mommy like to come inside and help me? I asked. Can we, Mommy? Can we? She begged her mother. Yes, sweetie, we can. You have to promise me you won't eat too many of Officer Meyer's cookies while I tell him something, she said to her daughter. I escorted them into my kitchen, poured 3 glasses of milk, and we sat at my small kitchen table. I guess I need to introduce myself. I'm Sarah Sullivan, Jessica's mother. I cannot begin to tell you how thankful I am for what you did yesterday. My mother called me this morning and told me I just had to ask you to come to dinner at their house this weekend, Friday, Saturday, or Sunday, whatever day works best for you. She told me to tell you no is not an option. Reaching for another cookie, Jess interjected, Please say you will come. Grandma is such a good cook. I just know you'll like it. I accept your invitation. What choice do I have when asked by two pretty ladies? Saturday night works best for me, I answered, looking at Sarah. Saturday, after placing Emma in her car seat along with Max on her lap, Lisa's mom and dad lived in Brookhaven, an upscale neighborhood east of Route 66 and a short drive from our apartments. Jess was right. Karen Davis was not just a good cook, she was a great one. Over dinner, I told them a little about myself and my lifelong desire to be a fireman. I was able to tell them several funny stories about some of the situations I found myself in while on duty. Did you ever shoot someone? Jess asked me. Jess! Sarah exclaimed. No, it's okay. That's a question I get asked frequently when talking with little kids. Yes, Jess, I shot someone once, I answered. Just as quick as that topic came up, Jess changed to her next question. Do you ever ride around in your fire truck with the siren on? Can you take me for a ride in your fire truck and turn the siren on? I think that would be really neat. Just then, Max ran into the room and demanded that Jess play with him. We all trooped out onto the patio to sit and watch the two of them race around the backyard. Once outside, I managed to turn the conversation around to stories about Sarah. It was getting late when we left Lisa's parents. I strapped Jess into her car seat, and Sarah put Max on her lap. We hadn't gone 2 blocks when both of them were fast asleep. As I parked Lisa's car in front of her unit, I told her what a great time I had. Your mom and dad are really nice. I like them a lot. I had a wonderful time. Would you thank your mom again for me, please? I asked. I enjoyed the evening too, she said. And thank you for not asking about the reason for Emma and my last name still being Sullivan. It's a sore subject with mother and father. I thought about it, but it's none of my business. If you want to tell me, that's fine. If you don't, it's all right. It certainly is not a deal breaker for me, I replied. I still want to see more of you. I unstrapped Jess from her seat after giving the sleeping puppy to Sarah and carried the little girl inside. I'll give Max a quick walk while you get Jess ready for bed, I told her. I'll be back in around 10 minutes. When I returned, Max scampered into Jess' room and hopped up on the bed, snuggling close to the sleeping little girl. Since I'm working the day shift, I get home about 4 in the afternoon. Would you like to go out with me Monday or Tuesday? I asked. Yes, but I'll need to find someone to watch Jess, she answered. That's not a problem. We'll take her with us. I'm sure we can find a kid-friendly restaurant to visit. That was the beginning of many more dates I had with Sarah. Sometimes, when her mom wasn't able to watch Jess, we took her with us. We went to the beach a lot, where I taught Jess how to swim. Sometimes we took her to the park for picnics or to the playground so she could run around. Truth be told, she was a remarkable little girl, and I enjoyed the times we had her accompany us. When I worked days, Sarah and I were able to see each other almost every day. When I worked the midnight shift, I was still able to meet with her for a few hours each day when she got home from work before I had to leave. The 3:11 shift was another story. I hardly ever got to see her other than taking her to lunch a couple of times a week and on my days off. This had been the reason my previous girlfriend had broken up with me. She had wanted more of my time and didn't understand that my job and I were a package deal. Not so with Sarah. She said she was just lucky to have me in her life and accepted the shift work. One night after coming home from dinner, Sarah said to me, I want to tell you about my mistake. When I was 20 and in my first year in college, I fell in love with a guy. I thought he loved me too. He was the first and only man I ever had sex with. I got pregnant, and when I told him, I expected him to be as happy as I was with the news. The first thing he asked me was if I was sure it was his baby. When I said yes, he asked me what I was going to do about it. When I asked him what did he mean, he said, well, you know, what about an abortion? I told him there would be no abortion. I'm Catholic, and I don't believe in abortion. The baby didn't ask to be conceived, and I wasn't going to end his or her life. He told me that he needed some time to get his head around being a father, and he would call me the next day. When the next day came and went without a call, I went over to his apartment and discovered he had moved out, leaving no forwarding address. Mother and father were not happy with the situation, but they stood by me and my decision. I never made any attempt to track him down. If he wasn't going to be there for me and his unborn child, I didn't want or need him in my life at all, ever. I went to school right up to the time Jess was born, and then I went back and finished when Jess was 1. My mom would watch her while I was in school. When I finished college, Father gave me a job with his investment firm. As soon as I started working and earning a paycheck, I moved into my own apartment. So, there you have it. If you don't ever want to see me again, you'll understand, she whispered with tears in her eyes. My response to her was to grab her into my arms and hold her tightly and whisper back into her ear, "What happened in the past stays in the past. I'm only interested in the future, a future with you and Jess in it." One day, several weeks later, we took the train to Miami and then the metro line out to the zoo. That was a great day. It was the first time Jess went from calling me Mr. Jake to Daddy Jake. On the way home, an elderly lady walked up to us and complimented me on my lovely family. Sarah and I looked at each other, smiled, and thanked her. That evening, after Jess had gone to bed, I said to Sarah, "Sweetheart, that woman was right. We do have a lovely family, and I would like to make it official. Will you marry me?" 10 months later, Sarah and I were married, and 6 months later, Jess' adoption by me was official. For 3 years, life was wonderful, and then my world was turned upside down. 3 years later, I was working the evening shift. As I got ready for work, Sarah came into the bedroom as I was dressing in my uniform. I asked her why she was home from work, and she told me she had some errands to run, and took the day off. "What I need, you can't get at the mall," I said, pulling her against me. "I love you, sweetheart." "I know," she replied, kissing me. "I love you too, but you'll just have to wait until you get home tonight, and I have a big surprise for you." "What is it?" I asked. "It wouldn't be a surprise if I told you now. You'll just have to wait," she replied, kissing me once more. Later that evening, so far it had been a quiet day, only a signal to a drunk pedestrian, which I had another unit transport to jail to sober up, and a signal 51, trespassing. I issued a trespass warning to him. If he returned, he would be arrested. Around 7 p.m., I decided to have something to eat. "Dispatch, Engine 6, 107 out of service at Sam's Diner, 1900 hours," I radioed. 104, Engine 6, dispatch replied. As I sat eating my supper, I heard over my radio about an armed robbery and shooting with multiple victims. The address was for someplace in the 500 block of East Main Street. I was too far away to be called for a backup role, so I finished eating. "Dispatch, Engine 6, 108 back in service at 1930 hours," I radioed as I returned to my truck. 104, dispatch acknowledged. For the next hour or so, I cruised behind some of the stores and several of the strip centers in my zone, looking for anything suspicious. "Engine 6, 1019, return to station, 1046, urgent," dispatch radioed me. 104, 1051 en route, I acknowledged. As I walked into the station 20 minutes later, I was instructed by the desk sergeant to report to Captain Wilson's office. "What's this all about?" I asked him. He shrugged his shoulders and told me he didn't know. All he knew was he had been instructed to tell me to go there as soon as I arrived. Taking the stairs 2 at a time, I went to the captain's office on the 2nd floor. I found 2 other men with him in his office. One was Luke Johnson, my longtime friend. After Luke had been shot a few years ago, he had been placed on limited light duty with the Detective Bureau. He liked it so much he transferred to the Bureau after being released from restricted duty. The other man I recognized was Father Daniel McCarthy, a priest at St. John's Catholic Church, where Sarah and her parents have attended for many years. He married us over 3 years ago. I knew him well, even though I'm not Catholic. Before any of them could speak, I knew something was terribly wrong. Luke came up to me and said, "Sarah and Jess were shot earlier this evening. They walked into a store during an armed robbery, Jake. They didn't survive. I am so very sorry." It felt as if something just sucked all the air from my lungs. I fell into a chair, not quite comprehending the enormity of it all. My wife and my daughter, gone in a senseless act of violence. After several minutes of complete silence, I whispered, "I have to call Mother and Father." Taking out my cell phone, I made the call. Mother answered on the 2nd ring. "Mother, it's me, Sarah and Jess." I couldn't finish, and handed the phone to Luke. "Mrs. Smith, this is Luke Johnson. I have horrible news. Sarah and Jess were killed earlier this evening." There was a pause while Luke listened to something Mother said. Then he continued, "Hello, Mr. Smith. I am so very sorry to have to break such bad news to you. Jake is too choked up to talk just now." Long pause. "Yes, sir, I'll tell him." Handing the phone back to me, he said, "Jake, your dad wants to talk to you. Just listen. He understands how you feel right now." I listened to my dad tell me he would contact my sister, and he and Mother would leave immediately. All I could do was whisper to him, "Thanks, Pop." We sat in the office for quite some time as Captain Moore, Father O'Connell, and Luke tried to comfort me. Finally, I asked if Lisa's parents had been notified. "Not yet, Jake," Luke replied. "I need to do it." "Father O'Connell, will you come with me?" I asked. "You're not in any condition to drive, Jake." "He'll drive you and the father there," Luke told me. We went out to the parking lot, and before getting into Tim's car, I gave him my gun belt, and radio to lock in the trunk. 10 minutes later, we pulled up in front of Tom and Judy Sullivan's home. As late as it was, the lights were still on in the house. Knocking on the front door, I was met by John Davis. The next 2 hours were the most emotionally charged moments of my life. Tom and Judy clutched each other as I held them both in my arms, with all three of us crying with grief. Father O'Connell managed to calm us down and begin the long process of healing. Some time later, I asked Luke to take me home. I needed to look after Jess' dog, Max. "Don't worry, it's not necessary," as he explained that his wife, Anna, had picked Max up earlier, and the dog was now with her. "Thanks, buddy," I told him. "Why don't you go home? It'll be all right." "No, Jake, I am staying right here with all of you," was his reply. With that, he went into the kitchen and made a pot of coffee. The rest of the night was spent trying to come to some understanding of the tragedy. At 6:30 the next morning, my cell phone vibrated in my pocket. I answered it. It was Father. My sister Emily's husband, Ryan, had rented a plane and flew the family from Augusta to Parkview Executive Airport. They were on the way to my house. I woke Luke, who had fallen asleep in one of the living room chairs, and asked him to drive me home. I explained to Tom and Judy that my parents had arrived and were now on their way to my place. I would see them later. Father O'Connell said he would stay with them. We arrived at my place a few minutes before Mother, Father, and the family arrived. The same emotional scene as the night before was repeated. After everything had settled down, we moved Mother and Dad's suitcases into the guest bedroom. Ryan, Nina, and their 2 girls would occupy the other 2 bedrooms. Later that afternoon, Father and John Davis went with me to the funeral home to make arrangements for Sarah and Jess. The funeral director told me they would transport the remains to the funeral home as soon as the medical examiner released the bodies. I selected 2 caskets for them. I was able to purchase 2 burial plots in the historic Greenwood Cemetery, located close to the Brookhaven neighborhood where Tom and Karen Davis lived. When we arrived back at the house, Luke and Anna were there. They brought Max with them, and he was busy getting to know my 2 nieces. Every so often, he went into Jess' room, sniffed, and looked around before returning to his 2 new friends. The following morning, the phone rang, and Mother answered it. She then told me the funeral director would be stopping by for some last-minute instructions. 20 minutes later, he arrived, and we all sat down in the living room. "Mr. Smith," he began, "the arrangements for your wife and daughter are complete. However, I would like to know your decision about your unborn child." "Unborn child?" I stammered, stunned by this news. "What unborn child?" "Oh, I am so sorry. I wasn't aware you didn't know. Your wife was pregnant. The medical examiner discovered a male fetus approximately 3 months old during the autopsy. What are your wishes concerning him?" That was the surprise she was going to tell me about the other night. "Oh my God," I cried to Mother and Father. Several moments later, after regaining my composure, I said, "I think the child should remain with his mother." "Is that a problem?" "No, sir, it is not," he stated emphatically. "We will do anything you wish. I am so sorry to have had to bring you this news." The next few days remain a blur in my memory. The funeral mass at St. John's was so well attended there wasn't an empty seat in the church. People were standing in the back as well as outside. Father O'Connell conducted the service at the church as well as at the graveside. So many of our friends and coworkers came by afterward to express their sympathy that I lost track of all of them. A few days later, Mother, Karen Davis, Nina, and Tim's wife, Anna, helped me in removing Lisa's and Jess' things from the house. All of Lisa's clothes were donated to various women's groups. Jess' clothes went to children's relief organizations. Lisa's jewelry I gave to the women and my nieces. The only things I kept were all the photo albums and Lisa's engagement and wedding rings, which I placed in my safe deposit box. Before Ryan, Nina, and the girls left for home, I spoke with both of them. I wanted to be sure they were okay with what I had in mind. Max needed children in his life, and I wanted him to be in a safe and loving home. Girls, I asked my nieces, would you like to take Max home with you? You have to promise me you will love him and take good care of him. They both rushed over to me, hugged me, and promised they would love him forever. Even Max barked his approval. The 5 of them left later that day to fly back home. Mother and father had decided to stay with me for a few more days, and then would fly back home commercially. 4 days after the funeral, I called Luke this morning and asked him for an update on the investigation into my wife and daughter's murder. He asked me to come down to the station after 10 a.m. Luke had been tapped to lead a team tasked with investigating the murder and robbery. I wanted father to come with me. When we arrived, Luke led us into his little office. I have some good news and some bad news, he said. First, the good news. He went on to explain that the convenience store had recently installed a state-of-the-art surveillance system. 5 digital cameras recorded everything to a computer hard drive. Microphones also sent sound to the hard drive. The computer automatically burned a DVD every 2 hours. No more fuzzy or grainy videotapes. Using facial recognition software along with fingerprints, our techs were able to identify the killer. His name was James Hamilton, and he had an extensive record, including a 7-year stretch in state prison for robbery. I would like to see the video, I asked Luke. Jake, I watched the video. It's brutal. Just watching it made me sick to my stomach, and every one of my men had the same reaction after viewing it. Your emotions are still pretty raw, so don't watch it right now. I'll tell you what's on it, he replied. He continued, Hamilton entered the store with a gun. He demanded that the clerk open the register, and after she complied, he shot her twice and grabbed the money. Sarah and Jess entered just as he killed the clerk. He shot both of them. Before he left, he stood over them and fired twice more into the back of their heads. Now the bad news. We haven't been able to find him. We've questioned every one of our CIs, confidential informants, with no luck. A bolo, be on the lookout for, has been sent out across the entire southeastern U.S. A $15,000 reward for information leading to his arrest has garnered hundreds of leads every day. It's taking a lot of time and manpower to follow up on each one of them. I wish I could say that we are close to an arrest, but I can't. I witnessed the distress on Tim's face as he told me all this. He was near to tears with frustration. I understand, I told him as we were leaving. I know you are doing everything you can. Just keep me in the loop if anything breaks. 5 days later, I went back to work after dropping mother and father off at Parkview International Airport for their flight back to Augusta. I was still on the 311 shift, but would rotate to midnights in a week. It was hard coming home to an empty house each night, and I was having difficulty falling asleep. All I could think of was how short a time Sarah and I had together. After a couple of sleepless nights, I began staying at the station and helping the night shift detectives sort through the hundreds of leads that came in each day. I only managed to get a few hours of sleep when I got back home in the early morning hours. When I went on midnights, I would stay until early afternoon, helping out before going home. 10 weeks later, weeks went by without any success. It was as if the earth had opened up and swallowed this guy. Finally, I was becoming worn out working what amounted to 2 consecutive shifts every day. Luke had been after me to slow down, but I kept putting him off. Then, one afternoon, Captain Moore cornered me. Jake, you look like death warmed over. When was the last time you got a full night's sleep? Your uniform is hanging off you. Just how much weight have you lost? The captain asked me. When you get overworked and tired, you make mistakes, and if you make a mistake in our business, it could get you killed. So, I have contacted personnel and arranged for you to take a week's leave. There will be no argument. As of today, you're on vacation. You are not to set one foot in the station. Do I make myself clear? I called your dad. He is expecting you to visit. I knew he was right and had my best interest at heart. Captain Moore was like a second father to me. He and my dad went back a long way. Father had actually broken him in when he was a rookie just out of the academy 25 years ago. I knew what he said was true, so all I could say was, "Yes, sir." I stayed with Mother and Father. They had a 2-bedroom condo on Augusta Beach. Ryan, Emila's husband, managed to take a few days off and took us fishing on his boat out in the Gulf. I actually caught a few grouper, which we grilled at his house for dinner that evening. Mother, Nina, and my 2 nieces fussed over me. Watching the girls play with Max reminded me of how Jess used to play with him. Surprisingly, I could look back on those memories without becoming too depressed. When I left them to make the 10-hour drive back home, I was in much better shape physically and emotionally. Returning to work, I went by Captain Wilson's office and thanked him for everything he did for me. I still stuck my head into the detective bureau every so often and helped sort through the leads. Those that had a chance of panning out, I sent along to the team. Other leads hit the round file. Some of them were off-wall. One guy said he saw Hamilton get into a flying saucer and blast off for another planet. Another said he witnessed Hamilton transform into a 3-headed monster and walk out into the Everglades. Then the leads began to slow from 100 a day to only 3 or 4. So, I increased the reward from $15,000 to $55,000. I could afford it. Sarah had been the expert in financial planning at her dad's firm. She used her talents to ensure our future. She had taken out a $505,000 double indemnity term life policy for each of us. Jess had a $200,000 whole life policy. That, coupled with other investments, left me with a little over $1.5 million when everything was settled. Truth be told, I would have exchanged every last dime of it to have my wife and daughter back. The additional reward money resulted in a few hundred more tips as to the location of James Hamilton. Unfortunately, these were dead ends as well. One evening, I was invited over to Tom and Judith's home for dinner. Afterward, while Judy was busy in the kitchen, I asked Tom for some advice on what to do with the money I now had. He recommended that I pay off the home mortgage and any other outstanding loans. The remainder should be invested. When I told him that I knew just the firm with which to do that, he just smiled. Judy returned to the dining room table with coffee and dessert and said to me, "Jake, Tom and I want to talk to you. It has been almost a year now since Sarah and Jess died. It's time for you to move on. You are still a young man. You need to make a new life for yourself." 8 months later, I had just gotten home from working a 311 shift. After grabbing something to drink from the fridge, I sat down and watched ESPN for an hour before heading to bed. The ringing of the phone on my night table woke me from a deep sleep. Looking at the clock as I picked up the phone, I wondered who in the hell was calling me at 3:30 in the morning. "Jake, it's Luke. We found him. We're going to make an arrest in about an hour. Do you want to be in on it?" "Are you kidding? Do I want to be in on it?" "I'll meet you at the station in 20 minutes, I replied. 25 minutes later, Luke, 10 other guys, and I were headed out. On the way over, Luke gave me a quick rundown on what happened. A little after 2 this morning, a guy came into the station and asked the desk sergeant if we were still looking for James Hamilton. He took the guy upstairs to the bureau office, and they immediately called me at home. When I got there, Charlie Taggart had him repeat what he had already told him. Luke explained. He continued telling me that the guy had been out in a bar and saw Hamilton drinking by himself. He knew him from playing hoops at the park with him a couple of years ago. He went over, said hello, and they talked until the place closed at 2. Hamilton asked for a ride home, so this fellow gave him one. "That's how we know where he is staying," Luke said as we pulled to a stop just down the street from a duplex north of 6th Street on 31st Avenue. At 4:40 a.m., we kicked in the front door, and turning on the lights in the bedroom, found Hamilton still in bed. An empty whiskey bottle was lying on the floor next to him. He had probably passed out and never heard us enter. Handing me a pair of handcuffs, Luke said, "You cuff him." "With pleasure," I replied through gritted teeth. What I really wanted to do was take my 9mm and put a couple of rounds into his sari, but I realized that would make me as bad as him. It would be best for the legal system to run its course. "James Hamilton, you are under arrest for armed robbery and murder." I then read him his Miranda rights. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. Do you understand the rights I have just read to you? With these rights in mind, do you wish to speak to us? He mumbled, no. Luke and I removed him from the house and took him back to the station. 5 other detectives remained and searched the duplex apartment. They found a gun, a couple of boxes of ammunition, and 100 in small bills. Luke and I were both there when he was arraigned at 9 that morning. Standing with his court-appointed attorney, Hamilton was formally charged with 3 counts of capital murder, armed robbery, and possession of a firearm by a convicted felon. No bail, and he was remanded to the county jail until trial. He left the courtroom the same way he entered, escorted by 2 very large sheriff's deputies, handcuffed and in shackles. There was some degree of satisfaction in seeing this unfold. I went by Tom Sullivan's office and was able to give him some good news. We had Lisa's and Jess Killer locked up. He was relieved to hear this and immediately called Judy and told her. Now all we could do was wait for his trial. In Georgia, there is the 180-day speedy trial law. That means an accused person has to be brought to trial in that time frame. Once the trial date has been set, both the prosecution and defense can ask for continuances. However, if the prosecution goes beyond the 180-day rule, the defendant can be set free. The defense is not bound by this stipulation. Once Washington's defense team learned that the prosecution was seeking the death penalty, they tried every legal trick to delay his trial. Finally, after the 3rd continuance expired, the judge ordered them to be prepared for trial in 10 days. There would be no more continuances granted. In spite of the high-priced anti-death penalty attorney brought in from Miami, the trial was a slam dunk for the prosecution. The jury of 7 men and 5 women deliberated for less than 4 hours. The verdict was guilty on all 5 counts. On the count of possession of a firearm by a convicted felon, the judge sentenced him to 10 years. On the armed robbery charge, he got 20 years, both sentences to run concurrently. The judge then reconvened the jury a week later to determine the penalty for the 3 murders. After 6 days of testimony for any extenuating circumstances, the court was adjourned for the jury to deliberate Washington's fate. At 4 the following afternoon, court was reconvened. The jury had reached a decision. The defendant was instructed to rise while the jury foreman read the decision. The foreman, a 30-some male, began reading. As to the first count of murder in the 1st degree of Judith Wilson, the jury recommends death. As to the second count of murder in the 1st degree of Sarah Smith, the jury recommends death. As to the final count of murder in the 1st degree of Emma Smith, the jury recommends death. So say we all, he finished, sitting back down in his seat. Does the defendant wish to make any statement before I pass judgment? The judge questioned Hamilton. He shook his head and said no. The judge then continued, and after recounting the heinous nature of the crimes, he said, "It is the sentence of this court that James Carver Hamilton be executed at a time and place to be determined by the state of Georgia in accordance with the verdict of a jury of your peers. God have mercy on your soul." After thanking the jury for their service, he dismissed them and adjourned court. As Hamilton was being led away, shackled and in handcuffs, I said just loud enough for him to hear, "I'll be there to watch when they stick that needle in your arm, ending your miserable life." Tom and Karen Davis, my mother and father, Luke, and his wife, along with several members of the fire department, were with me when the sentence was handed down. It was over. Almost 11 months since the murder of my wife and little girl, and justice had finally prevailed. Out in the hallway from the courtroom, the jury foreman came up to me and shook my hand. "In case you were wondering why it took so long for us to reach a decision," he said, "we had our decision within 5 minutes of getting back to the jury room. We didn't want to chance our decision being overturned on appeal for lack of due deliberation, and that's why we took so long." The Wilson family was also in the hallway, and I walked over to tell them what the foreman had said to me. I had come to know them quite well over the preceding months. Mrs. Wilson, a single mother, had been working a second job at the convenience store to save enough money for her 2 children to go to college. Both her son and daughter were good students in school and, even with financial aid, would not have been able to attend the university without her working that extra job. Luke and I looked into their background, and we decided to fully fund both of their college educations. It helped us knowing something good would come out of this tragedy. After leaving the courthouse, I drove to the cemetery. Standing in front of Lisa's and Jess Graves, I told them how much I loved and missed them. The man who had taken them from me had been captured, tried, and convicted. They could rest in peace knowing I would always remember them. I had been coming to Sam's Diner for breakfast since I went on midnights 2 months ago. It was easier to stop for breakfast there than going home and fixing something. Since I had the next 2 days off, I decided to run some errands instead of going home and going to bed after eating. The place was unusually packed this morning, and since tomorrow was my day off, I really was in no rush to be seated. I watched as a young woman who was waiting ahead of me was escorted by the hostess to a table. When the hostess returned, she came up to me and said that the woman told her to ask if I would like to share the table with her as the restaurant was so crowded. I agreed, and grabbing another menu, she led the way. Sitting down, I thanked the young woman for offering to share her table with me. She was Bertino, make that beautiful with dark brown hair and deep blue eyes. You probably don't remember me, do you? She asked. When I acknowledged that I didn't, she continued speaking. My name is Megan Howard, and I remember you. You saved my life over 8 years ago when you shot that man who was trying to assault and kill me. I told you then that I would never forget you. When I read about your wife and daughter being killed, I was horrified. Why do bad things happen to good people? I don't know. Anyway, I came to their funeral at St. John's. I saw how distraught and sad you were, and I just wanted to run up, put my arms around you, and tell you that everything would be okay, just like you did for me. I read in the paper a while ago that the man who killed them was tried, convicted, and got the death sentence. I'm glad of that. He deserves it. You have been in my thoughts and my prayers every day for all these years, and I am so happy to finally get to meet and talk with you again. By the way, how is your mom? I managed to interject. Mother died 2 years ago, she sadly answered. For quite a while after that incident, she was afraid to go out with anyone. Did you know that she had gone out with that guy several times? He seemed nice enough in the beginning, but then he started suggesting weird things to her. That's when she broke it off and told him not to come around anymore. You saw how well that worked, she told me. Anyway, she finally met a really nice guy. They got married 6 years ago. He treated her like a queen, and I really liked him. They moved up to a retirement community south of Ocala 4 years ago. There was nothing for me there, so I decided to stay here and go to school, she continued. Mother would call me every Sunday evening. One Sunday, when she called, she sounded terrible. There was a flu bug going around, and she must have caught it, is what she said. I asked her if she had gone to the doctor, and as usual, she had put it off. I made her promise to go the next day. The following morning around 10, my cell phone rang. It was Bill, her husband. He told me that Mother had gotten really sick in the middle of the night, and he had rushed her to the emergency room. It was too late. She died shortly after arriving. So, when I finished my bachelor's degree in elementary education, I got a job with the school district here in Jefferson County. Today is a school holiday, so I decided to treat myself to breakfast this morning. Saying that, she put her hand on my forearm and said, and I am really glad I did. I am too, I echoed. Walking out of the restaurant an hour later, we were met with a torrential downpour typical in South Georgia during the rainy season. Oh darn, I didn't bring an umbrella with me, she exclaimed. Looks like I'm going to get soaked waiting for the bus. Not wanting the morning to end, I said I'll give you a ride. Wait here while I run and get my car. No, that's too much trouble for you. I'll just wait here until it lets up. I was going to take the bus and run some errands and go shopping at the mall, she answered. Hey, it's no trouble at all. I need to pick up a few things at the mall myself. If you don't mind coming home with me for a few minutes while I change out of my uniform, we can go together, I replied. Okay, if you're sure it won't be any trouble, I would love that, she said. After finishing running all our errands and shopping, we stopped for a late lunch before I took Rebecca home. When she gave me her address, I recognized it as one I had been to before. The place was well known for drugs, gambling, and trade. When I voiced my concerns, she told me she was aware of it. This place was the only one she could afford close to the bus stops and the school at which she worked. Paying off my college loans doesn't leave much left over for a better place to live. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor, and as we walked up the outside staircase, I asked why she didn't use the elevator. Her reply was that it was too dangerous. You never know who's going to get on with you. It's just safer for me to climb the stairs. Walking down the corridor to her apartment, I noticed half the hallway lights were off, and it was semi-dark. As we approached the door to her apartment, I stopped her. The door to her apartment was partially open, with fresh marks on it where someone had pried the door lock to gain entry. I could hear noises inside. Stepping back, I told her to dial 911, tell them there is a burglary in progress, give them your name and address, and tell them that Officer Jake Myers is inside your apartment, and he is armed and needs assistance. Removing my weapon from its holster strapped to my left calf, I went inside. I surprised two men rifling through Rebecca's belongings. Police, I shouted. Do not turn around. Put your hands on top of your head and interlace your fingers. When they complied, I then said, now slowly go down on your knees. Make any sudden moves, and believe me, I will shoot you. A couple of minutes later, I heard a voice from the hallway. Myers, where are you? Back bedroom. I have two down on their knees, I shouted back. Meanwhile, Rebecca did exactly as I instructed. She called 911, gave them her name and address, and what I told her to say. The operator told her to stay on the line and that help was on the way. She heard yelling from inside her apartment but couldn't make out what was being said. When she relayed this to the 911 operator, she was told that the police were in the parking lot and were on the way up the stairs. She saw two officers emerge from the stairs at the end of the corridor. They saw her and ran to her apartment and went inside. A couple of minutes later, they came out with two men who she recognized as living downstairs, both in handcuffs. I followed them out. Coming over to her, I took her hand and led her back into her apartment. She was absolutely horrified at the damage those two men had done. Everything she owned was scattered about. The contents from the drawers of her dresser had been dumped on the floor. Stacked next to the front door was her school-issued laptop, her mother's jewelry box, along with her small flat-screen TV and DVD player. She couldn't help but to start crying. She fell heavily onto the sofa, and I sat beside her. Putting my arm around her and pulling her close, I said, "You'll be okay. It's over now. They won't be back, but you can't stay here tonight." "Where can I go?" she cried. "My friend Susan is in the Keys with her fiancé, or I would be able to stay with her. I haven't any money for a motel, even if I could find one." "Well, gather up your things, and you will stay at my house tonight. Tomorrow we'll figure out something," I said to her. When I told Rebecca that she would be staying the night with me that fateful day, little did I realize that when I said that we would think of something, that something would be her moving in with me permanently. When we couldn't find an apartment she could afford or one of which I would approve, I suggested she move permanently into the guest bedroom. She agreed, with the stipulation she would pay me rent. After some argument I agreed. So, once a month, she paid me $500, and I simply put it into an investment fund in her name without telling her. She was a joy to have around. I no longer was allowed to do any house cleaning or any of the cooking. That was great because my idea of a gourmet dinner was a frozen burrito from the microwave. She was always there to greet me when I came home, no matter what shift I worked. It wasn't too much longer that we started going out in the evenings on my days off. Rebecca soon went from being a roommate to being my girlfriend. I soon fell in love with this beautiful, charming, and articulate young woman. Engine 6, stopping vehicle, 1028, check registration, tag Alpha Charlie Hotel 3379, iRadio dispatch. The driver had pulled to the side of the road just as soon as I lit him up with my blue lights. I pulled him back slightly to the left of his stopped car to protect him from passing traffic. As I approached the car, I saw a young man in the uniform of a U.S. Marine. As he handed me his driver's license, I said to him, "I pulled you over for exceeding the posted speed limit of 45 miles per hour. I clocked you in excess of 60 miles per hour. I am sorry. I have no excuse for speeding, officer. I just returned home from being deployed in Afghanistan for a year. I am on my way home to see my wife and baby girl. I haven't seen her since she was born. I guess my mind wasn't on my driving." Taking his license and some paperwork for the rental car from him, I walked back to my patrol car and ran the license through DMV. It came up clean. Dispatch confirmed the rental car registration. Here was a young man who had made a sacrifice in his life to do what was right for his country. There was no way I was going to give him a speeding ticket. Corporal Samuels, I said to him after handing him his license and paperwork, slow down. You wouldn't want to have an accident after all you have been through for the past year. Your wife and baby need you home safe and sound. Remember, slow down and pay attention to your driving. Go home, be safe, and have a great reunion with your family. Thank you for your service. After thanking me and promising to obey the speed limits, he left. As I was walking back to leave the scene, a speeding car sideswiped my patrol car and then struck me. It was the last thing I remembered until I woke up in the hospital. I had listed Luke as my emergency contact in addition to my parents. He was contacted, and since he was aware of my relationship with Rebecca, called her. Regaining consciousness and becoming aware of my surroundings, I found her sitting beside me, holding my hand, and with her head lying on the bed next to my chest. What happened? I asked. Luke, who had been sitting on the other side of my bed, answered, Drunk driver who didn't obey the move over law hit your patrol car and then you, Jake. You were really lucky. You went over the top of his car and not under it. You've got a broken left ankle and a severe concussion. The doctor will fill you in on the particulars later. Rebecca then said, I was so worried about you when Luke called. I couldn't imagine what my life would be like without you in it. I love you. I have always loved you. You're going to be okay. We will get through this together, she said, with tears streaming down her cheeks. The doctor came in and checked me over and then announced that I would be released the next day, provided I had someone to stay with me just in case. That's not a problem, doctor, Rebecca told him. Rebecca drove us home the next morning, helping me with my crutch as we went inside. I had just sat down when the phone rang. It was my mother. Rebecca spoke with her for a few minutes before handing the phone to me. After assuring and reassuring my mom that I was all right and she didn't have to drive down to take care of me, I handed the phone back to Rebecca. She spoke with my mom and told her everything the doctor had said, that all I needed was to rest and stay off my ankle for a while. Everything would be fine, but she would call each day with an update on my condition. Mother must have said something because Rebecca giggled and answered, Yes, I know. Don't worry. I'll take good care of him. After lunch, I said that I wanted to go to my bedroom. I couldn't take any painkillers because of the concussion, but I needed to lie down for a while. She helped me into the bedroom, and as she hung my shirt up in the closet, I saw she had moved some of her clothes into my closet. I think I need to sleep in here with you in case you need something during the night, she explained. I recovered some weeks later and went back to work. She never moved back into the other bedroom, and I was all too happy to have her share my bed. In April, during Rebecca's spring break from school, I decided to take some time off, and we would visit my folks in Augusta. Even though they knew all about Rebecca and how much she meant to me, they had never met face-to-face. Oh, to be sure, my mom and Rebecca had talked on the phone numerous times, even after my recovery. It still would be the first time actually seeing one another. We arrived late in the afternoon after a long but pleasant drive. Rebecca was a big hit with both mother and father. Mother said Rebecca could have the second bedroom and I could sleep on the sofa in the living room or go to my sister's house. I told my mom that it wouldn't be necessary. Rebecca and I have been sharing a bedroom ever since my accident. When I said that, Mother stuttered, Oh my, okay. Father just winked at me, grinned, and asked, When's the wedding going to be? Just as soon as possible after he asked me, Rebecca replied to my dad. Well, I was going to wait until tomorrow, but now is as good a time as ever. Producing a ring box from my pocket, I got down on one knee in front of her. Megan Howard, I love you deeply. You mean the world to me. Will you marry me? I managed to stammer. In case you were wondering, the ring I gave her was not the one from my safe deposit box. Before I could regain my feet, Rebecca dropped to her knees and, throwing her arms around me, said yes, yes. After we both regained our feet and Mother had managed to recover enough to hug her, and then me, saying, We have to call Nina right now and share this news with her and Ryan, Father shook my hand, patted me on the back, and congratulating us, said to Rebecca, Welcome to the family, sweetheart. 20 minutes later, Nina, Ryan, and the two girls showed up. Ryan had brought a couple of bottles of champagne with which to celebrate our engagement, and we did celebrate long into the night. One evening, shortly after we returned to Fort Lauderdale, we went out to dinner at the Harborview restaurant overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. We had just been seated when Tom and Karen Davis walked in. I pointed them out to Rebecca and told her who they were and what they meant to me. She insisted that I get up and asked them to join us for dinner. When I brought them to our table, Rebecca stood as I introduced them. She hugged each of them. We had a thoroughly enjoyable evening. Telling them about our plans to be married was met with enthusiastic congratulations. Both Judy and Tom wanted to know all the details of the upcoming event. As we left the restaurant and said our goodbyes, I saw Rebecca whisper into Judy's ear, and Judy whispered something back to Rebecca. Some months later, Judy told me what the two of them had said to each other. It didn't surprise me. Rebecca had a way about her that made everyone love her. She and Judy became the best of friends. Judy soon began to think of Rebecca as a second daughter. We were married in late June. Luke was my best man, and my sister Nina was the matron of honor. Ryan and one of my friends from the fire department, as well as Tim's wife, Anna, and one of Rebecca's colleagues from school, rounded out the wedding party. Rebecca had insisted that Tom and Judy sit in the place of honor on the bride's side of the church. I thought it might be awkward for them, but they both assured me that they were honored by Rebecca's request. After a short honeymoon, we returned home, and I went back to work. 2 months later, Rebecca returned to her teaching job at an elementary school much closer to our home. Early one Saturday morning in October, the bedside phone rang. Rebecca answered it, and rolling over to me, she gave me the handset. "It's Luke. He wants to talk to you." Glancing at the clock on my night table, I saw it was only 6:30 a.m. "Hey Luke, what's so important that you had to call at such an ungodly hour?" I asked. "Thought you might want to know James Hamilton is dead. He was stabbed to death by another inmate on death row last night. Evidently, he said something that pissed off the wrong guy and got a shank shoved into his chest. This news didn't bring any satisfaction to me, but it did bring some sense of final closure. Thanks, Luke. I appreciate the heads up." When I told Rebecca the news, she hugged me, and all she said was, "I hope he rots in hell." 1 year later, it was a little past 3 a.m. when I finally got home from my evening shift. A tanker truck had overturned coming out of Port Everglades at the intersection of State Road 84 and South Federal Highway, spilling several hundred gallons of diesel fuel just after 9 in the evening. As the junior road patrol sergeant I had been promoted a few months ago, it fell to me to stay on scene until the hazmat team and fire department cleaned it up so we could reopen the intersection. Being as quiet as I could, I locked my weapons in the gun safe in the closet, and after undressing, I slid into bed. "What time is it?" a sleepy voice asked me. "I tried to stay awake after you called, but I just couldn't." "That's okay. It's after 3. Go back to sleep, sweetheart." "You need your rest," I answered. Snuggling up to me with her arm over my chest, she whispered in my ear, "The babies know when you're not here. They've been restless all night. They just now settled down when you got into bed." "It won't be too much longer, honey," I whispered back. "It's just a matter of a few weeks now." She was soon fast asleep, and before I drifted off, I thought back to the day she told me I was going to become a daddy. It was a Sunday. We had come home from church, and after a light lunch, we sat together on the patio enjoying the afternoon. "I'm going to go inside and get a beer. Can I get you a glass of wine, honey?" I asked. "No, thank you, but a glass of iced tea would be great," she replied. "Sure thing. I'll be right back," I said, getting up from my seat. When I returned, I placed the glasses on a small table between us and sat back down. "Jake, I have something to tell you." Smiling sweetly, she got up from her chair and sat in my lap. "I won't be drinking any alcohol for a while. You're going to be a daddy. My home pregnancy test strip showed positive this morning. I'm making an appointment tomorrow with the doctor to confirm it." The following week, it was confirmed. We were having a baby. I was overall happy. We decided not to tell anyone, just in case, until she started showing. 3 months later, when I got home from work, Rebecca handed me a double scotch on the rocks and told me I needed to sit down. I went in for my checkup this morning, and the doctor ran some tests. "Brace yourself, Jake. We're not having a baby. We're having 2 babies, twins." The doctor was unable to determine the sex yet. We'll have to wait at least another month for that, or we could wait and be surprised. I elected to find out as soon as possible. I wanted to start working on turning one of the bedrooms into a nursery, and I needed to know blue or pink paint for the walls. Then we could start buying appropriate furniture and clothing for the twins. 6 weeks later, I found out I would be converting another of the bedrooms. One would be pink, and the other blue. It was really fun doing the work. Rebecca helped me a lot until she was too far along in her pregnancy, and I refused to allow her to do any more work. Just as I drifted off to sleep, cuddled up to Rebecca, I thought to myself, now comes the hard part, the waiting. 10 days later, Rebecca and I were the proud parents of twins, one boy and one girl. We named our son Michael Thomas Myers after my father, and our daughter Emma Marie Myers. Luke and Anna Johnson were named godparents for our son, and Nina and Ryan were the godparents for our little girl. My mom and dad were thrilled to now have 4 grandchildren. Karen Davis fell in love with both of our babies, and she and Tom soon became adopted grandparents. I think often of Sarah and Jess, but somehow I believe that they both have become the twins' guardian angels, and it gives me comfort. And that's Jake's journey, a life of courage and resilience. What do you think? Can new bonds truly heal old wounds? Let us know in the comments. Thanks for watching.